Just to share Dr. Sinnott's bio for everybody. He's visually impaired and neurodivergent. Robbie is coordinator of Voice of Vision Impairment, which he founded in 2019 to be Ireland's disabled persons representative organisation, specialising in issues relating to the rights of visually impaired, i.e. blind and partially sighted people. Before this, Dr. Sinnott had a long and successful record as a human rights campaigner, including being vindicated in a High Court case against the state in 2017 for the right of visually impaired people to properly vote in elections and referenda. He was ably and excellently represented in that case by Michael Lynn SC and the Eversheds solicitor team, including Philip Reynor, both of whom will present after Dr. Sinnott. So a warm welcome, Robbie, this evening, and I'll hand over to you for your presentation.
Thanks very much, Derval. Excuse me for my voice. It's just as well I am not with you all in person because, well, I don't know if it's COVID I have, but whatever I have, you wouldn't want to be in the same room, so I'm hoping my voice holds out. But, excuse me. I suppose, yeah, Derval alluded to it there. It's DPOs. These organisations are known as in Ireland, but also disabled persons representative organisations are DPROs, and I suppose the reason for that is that they are referred to in the CRPD and in other documents from the UN as representative organisations, and their representative organisations, they being us, disabled people. So that's where we have the logic of DPRO, and also DPO also stands for several other things like Data Protection Officer and Designated Public Official. So just we think some DPROs think it's useful, but you'll see in the slides that DPO is used because a lot of DPROs still prefer the term DPO. So we're a broad canvas. So I suppose, where does the concept come from, DPO or DPRO? It comes from the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, CRPD. And the CRPD is like a legal guide to how governments should treat disabled people. And I suppose the person or the people in charge of saying what all that means is the UN committee, and the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So it's constantly looking at the CRPD and seeing how it's being implemented or not, or how it's working or it isn't. And the UN Committee publishes documents every so often called General Comments, and it has published since 2013. That's in the last 10 years. It has published 8 of them, I think. I think there's a 9th on the way to do with welfare reform, timely enough, given what our state is proposing at the moment with a green paper. So yeah, so the idea of the general comments is to help everybody understand. They're like clarifications. They're basically explaining what is meant by the various paragraphs in the CRPD. Now, also a lot of states have, what's done is ratified the CRPD. In fact, most countries in the world have, and that's a very big commitment, an internationally binding commitment to make sure that the CRPD is implemented. Ireland implemented the CRPD ratified it in 2018, which was quite late, since it was, I think we could have done it in 2006 or 2007. So the government was saying it was making sure it got everything right, and it doesn't really explain why it has done so little on it in the next 5 or 6 years. But anyway, hopefully we're all optimistic, I think. So what does the CRPD, sorry, we'll move it on to slide 2 there. Nicole, you've done it already. I don't want to be preempting it. What CRPD, what does it say about DPROs or DPOs? Well, I suppose you can see there, Article 4.3 is the big one, and it's the...
Sorry, Robbie, just to say, yeah, we're not seeing the screen share.
Oh, yeah, what it says.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a note. we're having issues just having the ISL on screen with the presentation. So Robbie, we might go without the presentation just to make sure that anyone watching ISL is definitely able to see this. So we're just having a technical issue with that, but you can go ahead and I will share the presentations afterwards if that's okay.
Okay, very good. Yeah, great. Okay, brilliant.
Thanks, Robbie.
Okay, so yeah, Article 4.3 then, it basically says that in the implementation of the convention and in just about anything else relating to disability, I had the quote on, but you'll get the quote on the script that will be sent out, and basically that states parties shall consult with and actively involve disabled people through their representative organisations. Now that's the representative, or that's the RO and DPRO there. So in a legal opinion that VVI commissioned involving our two esteemed guests tonight, Phil and Michael, it was clarified that the only representative organisations in this regard are DPROs. So they're not what people would traditionally think as representative organisations, which have generally been the large service providers or the big brand names. And okay, so it says that the other part is Article 33.3. Now they are mentioned in other places in the CRPD itself too, like Article 29B, etc. But in that's part to do with political participation. So basically, the whole point of DPROs, a massive point, is the whole participation in society. But Article 33 is Article 33.3 is all about implementation and monitoring, and so it says that in particular, disabled people and their representative organisations. Now, in General Comments 7, so this is, remember that we were speaking earlier on about General Comments. Now, in them General Comments, it was all about, it said that the DPROs must be leading that implementation and monitoring system, and that they should be prioritised, their views and opinions in such systems. And their views and opinions should be prioritised in anything to do with disability, because we are the collective voices. So apologies if I'm going too fast for our ISL interpreters. I'm trying to be conscious of doing it slow. Again, in Ireland, it says there, sorry, it doesn't say, but in Ireland, again, DPOs, DPROs is generally, other parts of the world are known as different things. So organisations of people with disabilities, deaf and disabled persons represented, or organisations in Britain, for instance. And there's I suppose it's all about it's all about diversity and allowing for what people prefer themselves. And so the meaning of what a DPRO is given in General Comment 7 in paragraphs 10 to 12 and also 13 and 14 and throughout the document, I suppose. And they have to be predominantly based on human rights. So they have to be basically they have to be set up to advance human rights effectively. That has to be their priority. That's the core thing that they're set up to do. They have to be run and led and directed by disabled people. Now, there's no qualification there, so we might have to ask legal interpretation later on. But like, as opposed to, it says a clear majority of their members should be disabled. And it says that the staff must especially be disabled. But in the running, directing, and leading, there's no qualification there. So it just says like they should be run, directed, and led by disabled people. I suppose the word "should" is that's the ideal if that can be done. But certainly, like the CRPD is the baseline, so we should be aiming, I think, for as good as we can possibly do. There's also a distinction between organisations for people with disabilities and organisations of people with disabilities. So DPROs are organisations of people with disabilities. Organisations for people with disabilities are those who advocate on behalf of disabled people, or else provide services for people with disabilities, or disabled people. Now, I suppose there's no sentence in General Comment 7 that says DPROs cannot be service providers. It doesn't, but I suppose the general logic that I would read from it is that, for instance, it says that it should be distinguishing of and for. So if an organisation is claiming to be a DPRO set up primarily to advance human rights, if it is also a FAR organisation in terms of providing services for people with disabilities, well, that is sort of, it's not distinguishing between the two. It's sort of blurring the lines. And I suppose practically speaking, it means how, if an organisation is providing a service and is the primary representative organisation, how can that be accountable if people don't like the services it is providing? So, so that's so a lot of, clearly the most disabilities service providers in Ireland, they're not DPROs today, and there's a conflict of interest. Indeed, there will a possible conflict of interest. The UN committee says in trying to do both and trying to be say they're representative and if they're of and for, etc. So
a 5 minute, Robbie, you asked for a check-in at 5 minutes to go.
Excellent, yeah. So there are different types of DPRO, and so there's coalitions, and they have to involve all DPROs. They can't be exclusive. They can't say, well, we only want some and not others. And so they're also known as umbrella organisations. There's also there's interesting ones. I suppose what could be known as there's self-advocacy organisations, particularly for those with intellectual disabilities. And there's something like what I suppose some of us refer to as 12D organisations, which are organisations which include relatives of disabled people. So I suppose people with dementia or children, etc. And the goal there is that they have to be do as much as they possibly can to make sure that it's the actual voice of their members that they're representing, or that is being represented. And then the last one is cross-sectional. So we're talking about excuse me. Yeah. So it's talking about cross-sectional, which means that in any other of the minority statuses that people can, for instance, be, for instance, you can mix disability plus gender, disability plus ethnicity, disability plus traveller status, disability plus age, in whatever constituency, and that's also a big part of the human rights. So a DPRO can be set up along those lines as well. So what Ireland must do, well, I suppose that Ireland must firstly let all its departments, etc., public bodies, all public bodies and service providers and businesses indeed, be aware that in consultations, DPROs come first, and in implementation and monitoring. And what that looks like is, it means that the opinions and views of DPROs are prioritised, and that there are DPRO-only spaces for consultation. And we say that bilateral is definitely preferable for many constituencies, given the particular needs that we would have, for instance, as visually impaired people, to make sure that graphs, etc., are explained and stuff. Also that our DPRO rights should be incorporated into Irish law, and also that also, sorry, there's text coming across there, which isn't, sorry, it's coming across in my screen reader. So part of 60, part of the whole thing as well is the idea that DPROs need to be able to take class actions. And so all of this is happening. For instance, there's a planning and development bill going through. It's a perfect opportunity to make sure there's an accessibility impact statement involved. And it is just not happening. But this should be happening regularly. Everything should be disability proofed in that way. Now, that's not a radical idea. The National Disability Authority came up with that idea in 2013, but it hasn't been acted on. They even gave a template for it. But we continue to campaign for that and to make sure it's CRPD compliant. And okay, I suppose another one is that Ireland should give full DPRO rights, and that also means that it should capacity build. So like it's not, if you set up a residents association of all blind people, you would have difficulties in terms of making sure, like, not everybody can read the same formats, etc. And people are of different levels, different supports. And being based on human rights, we have to prioritize those with least supports, least resources. And so it's not just a simple democracy or majority rule. It's basically, we have to prioritize human rights. That can be a minority of one. So for instance, people who read Braille are a minority, a small minority among visually impaired people, even among totally blind people. But we have rights. Braille readers have rights, so it doesn't matter The research won't pick that up, but the DPROs will, and DPROs have to be also involved very closely in research. There's a research and ethics bill going through the Dáil that should refer to the CRPD. The optional protocol is something else that should be. It means that we can go to the UN committee and it can pronounce it. That's all. It has no power to do anything, but it can just set the record straight and tell the state, well, you're not actually implementing CRPD, or you're not understanding Article 4.3 here. So it just makes it public, and it gives us validity outside of absolutely brilliant pro bono legal advice, which is, I think, top class as well, which we're very, very lucky. So, and finally, capacity. There's a need for, as I was saying about resident associations, etc. We need help from the state to be able to set up. We can't even set up a bank account accessibly. The visually impaired, all visually impaired people spread across the country. We need help in going through the forms and CLGs, applying for bubble grants and all the rest of it. That is something that we would need assistance doing, that another organisation would not necessarily do so. And so this is just so that we can fill that gap, fill that niche, fill the space that has been set out by the CRPD. But it makes sense. You wouldn't ask an employer to represent workers. You wouldn't ask Tesco to represent its customers in customer rights. So it's only proper and it's straightforward that you wouldn't have men on the National Women's Council. It wouldn't be led by men anyway. And so it's really important that this space is it's quite vulnerable. It's a very difficult space at the moment, but it's really important that we get there, and we will get there. Thank you very much.
That's a great hopeful note to end on, Robbie, and certainly that was an incredibly informative presentation, so thank you for that. And there'll be a chance for a Q&A session hopefully at the end with the panelists, so I'm sure there might be some questions coming through. And I know Nicole, as our DPCN coordinator, had asked people to send questions in advance as well, so we'll get to those towards the end. I'll just take this chance to talk you through the rest of the session. So our next presenters will be looking at the role of DPOs, a legal perspective, and we're pleased to welcome Philip Reynor from Eversheds, Sutherland, and Michael Lynn, Senior Counsel. We'll take a break then for just 5 minutes, a short comfort break. We'll come back at 7:45 and we'll get into a practical part of the session. So what DPOs look like and the work that they do, and an international perspective also. And Adrian, Carroll of AsIAm will lead that session. And then at 8, we'll get into that Q&A session with our panelists. So next up, I'd like to welcome up our two next presenters and panelists. We have Michael Lynn, SC, is a Senior Counsel and member of the Law Library. He's a graduate of Trinity College Dublin. Michael practices in both civil and criminal law with a particular interest in human rights. He's been in many cases involving the rights of disabled persons, including representing Robbie Sinnott in his case against the state, in which he succeeded in obtaining a High Court order that the voting procedures in place at that time were in breach of his constitutional rights. We'd also welcome Philip Reynor. Phil is an associate solicitor in Eversheds, Sutherland LLP. He's a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and UCD. Phil specialises in commercial court litigation and dispute resolution with a focus on complex real estate, landlord and tenant disputes, contractual disputes, building and construction related disputes, and also judicial review proceedings. Phil has been working with Robbie Sinnott and VVI for a number of years with a particular focus on the rights of persons with disabilities, the UNCRPD, and Ireland's implementation and compliance with its obligations under that convention. So a really warm welcome to our two next panelists who are going to share their thoughts and their expertise and their knowledge with us this evening. And thank you for being with us.
Thanks a million, Derval. And thanks to everyone for organising the event and inviting us to be here. It's a real privilege to get to talk at this. And just to give you a bit more of that background. So we did work, Eversheds and I worked with Robbie in the past, and we've spoke about that already. More recently, VVI through Robbie raised a query with us, with Eversheds, in relation to what constitutes disabled persons organisations under the UNCRPD. So it's to that kind of point, and the role of the DPO or the DPORO that I'm going to be talking about today. Like Michael then will kind of tackle how the UNCRPD is situated within the Irish, possibly EU legal framework. And that'll constitute the last 5 minutes of our presentation. But ultimately, it kind of the whole thing springs out of concerns that were raised by VVI, that it wasn't being adequately recognised, it wasn't being appropriately prioritised, and it wasn't being consulted as a DPO. And as we'll see, under the UNCRPD, which Ireland signed in 2007, and it took them 11 years then to ratify that, a DPO or a DPORO has an acknowledged role to play in public consultation and decision making. So VVI and other DPOs should be facilitated in carrying out those functions. Instead, and I think this is something that Robbie could really speak to, and I've seen his extensive work and his amazing ongoing efforts. VVI and I think other DPOs have met with significant obstacles in their attempts to assume that role. For me, as a solicitor or as a lawyer, I'd look at all this in terms of expertise, I suppose. Like you have to ask the question, who are the experts here? So just to take an example, if I'm running a construction case in the High Court, this might be something about an architect has messed up a building, design-wise, an engineer has messed up something. There are defects there. So when we're doing that case, who does the judge want to hear from? And I mean, it seems obvious, but when you move it across to the DPO section, it's suddenly not so obvious. But it's obvious to anyone who's ever seen a movie about a legal case in court. The judge wants to hear from, if there's an architectural defect, is the architect. If it's an engineering defect, it's the engineer. And the reason for that is because anyone else who speaks to those issues just simply isn't credible. There's no credibility there. Like, I can't go up and speak to what's wrong with a building from an architectural perspective because I'm just not an architect, and no one should be asking me to do that. And one of the key principles at the center of the CRPD is the fundamental role to be given to DPOs or DPOs in order to ensure the effective participation of disabled persons in public life. And that's just key. This kind of participation, the aim of it is to guarantee disabled people as the experts that they're fully involved in the making of decisions that affect their lives and rights at all levels. And it's this pooled expertise and collective agency, I suppose, of disabled people. That's what's extremely important here. It's the lived knowledge, it's the lived day-to-day experience, and that, for me, is what's credible. That's the expertise there that people need to be leaning on, and that's what the UNCRPD realizes. So, what is a DPO, and what is it supposed to be doing? So, the essence of a DPO is that it's effectively composed of disabled people. As Robbie said, it's led by them. It's an organization owned and led by disabled people, which thereby ensures the full participation, their understanding, and the promotion of their interests. And paragraph 11 of General Comment 7, I'm just going to read that briefly. It says, they can only be those that are led, directed, and governed by persons with disabilities. A clear majority of their membership should be recruited among persons with disabilities themselves. And that again is another absolutely key phrase, a clear majority, because this implies something more substantial than a simple majority where you could have a 51 to 49 ratio. A clear majority suggests that a DPO is something that should have very definitive structures in terms of that it being clearly led and governed by disabled people. In other words, the structure of the whole entity must ensure that leadership and that governance is in place. And the UNCRPD draws a It draws what is a very important distinction between DPOs and other civil society organisations, and emphasises strongly the special place of DPOs and the priority that they should be given in ensuring their participation in proposed legislation, in initiatives aimed at assisting disabled persons. And again, I'll just read again from paragraph 13 there. It says, States parties should give particular importance to the views of persons with disabilities through their representative organisations, that is DPOs, support the capacity and empowerment of such organisations, and ensure that priority is given to ascertaining their views in the decision-making process. I mean, I think that's quite clear. So what's the role? Robbie mentioned earlier Article 4.3 of the CRPD, and I'm going to quote a little bit from that as well. It says, States parties shall closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities, including children with disabilities, through their representative organisations. Again, this is very, very clear. And I suppose we've spoke a bit about General Comment 7, and it's quite instructive here. But we have to say that the CRPD committee, it's published guidance on the convention to help everybody understand what it means. So General Comment 7 isn't part of the convention per se. It's more a guidance on the participation of disabled persons and how to read it. So when we're discussing the definition of representative organisations, the wording of paragraph 10 of General Comment 7 makes it clear that the phrase representative organisations is another expression which means organisations of persons with disabilities, or DPOs, DPOs. So by defining a representative organisation specifically as a DPO, it's intended that DPOs are to be the only representative organisations for the purpose of disability. Robbie said as much earlier on, and I fully agree with that. Another important part of this, General Comment 7, it says that effective and meaningful participation of persons with disabilities through the representative organisation is at the heart of the convention. Again, I just think this is very, very clear what needs to happen here. And quoting from it directly, and this is a relatively long quote, it says, often persons with disabilities are not consulted in the decision-making about matters relating to or affecting their lives, with decisions continuing to be made on their behalf. And I mean, it goes on in that vein, and I won't go through the rest of the quote, but there's one little piece that says, the motto, quote, nothing about us without us, resonates with the philosophy and history of the disability rights movement, which relies on the principle of meaningful participation. So in addition to providing for consultation through DPOs, Article 33.3, which Robbie also mentioned earlier, that article is on the national implementation and monitoring aspect of it. So, you know, DPOs need to be involved in, are we doing this right? That says civil society, in particular persons with disabilities and their representative organisations, shall be involved and participate fully in the monitoring process as well. So it's not just consultation on this side when we're going to do, say, something from a legislative point of view, but it's also in reporting back to the UN on how Ireland is doing, generally speaking, on this. And they need to be, disabled persons need to be consulted and involved and participate fully in that process, because who has more of the expertise on who's doing, if Ireland is actually fulfilling its obligations here at all. So to put that another way, it's for the experts to say how we're doing. Are we complying? Are we consulting? Are we actively involving disabled persons through their DPOs?
So about 5 minutes left, Philip. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. I'm going to hand over to Michael now in just 2 seconds, but just to say, and I should say this, general comments such as these, like there's the general comments and then there's the CRPD itself. So the general comments, and you can see that the language is more loose, it's more informal. They're talking about mottos, and it's to give a sense, it's for interpretative purposes, like what does the CRPD mean? But that doesn't mean it doesn't have any force. It does. It has persuasive force, is the kind of way we talk about it in legal circles, if you like. So while they're technically not part of the convention and their guidance, they do have importance as to how the UNCRPD should be interpreted and how they should be relied on. And the Supreme Court of Ireland, for example, does use general comments in its deliberations on how to understand these legal instruments. So what's the bottom line? A government report on the CRPD committee should involve disabled persons through DPOs in assessing how the government is carrying out its obligations under the CRPD. That's your monitoring, that's your involvement. The centre place given to DPOs by the CRPD implies that states parties need to be rigorous in determining what organisations are DPOs and what's not. So we need a proper register. Who's a DPO? Do they have a clear majority in their membership, and so on? And there's obvious reasons why that needs to be determined, and that register needs to be built. And as I said, there needs to be significant and meaningful consultation with the experts, that is, disabled persons and their representative organisations. I'm going to turn over to Michael now, if that's all right with you, Michael. And I think Michael's going to talk to how the legal framework surrounding the UNCRPD operates.
Okay, thank you, Phil, and I hope everybody can hear me. And thank you, Derval, for inviting me. And yes, as Phil said, it's a great privilege to be involved in this webinar. And I mean, you've heard from Robbie and you've heard from Phil about the importance of DPOs and DPROs in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I have to sound a slightly negative note. I don't want it to be too negative, but I want to just put in context where the convention stands as a matter of Irish law. People are often surprised to find that, our government goes out and signs international treaties and international covenants, but they're actually not enforceable. They're not answerable for those in our own domestic Irish courts. They are answerable in respect of them to the United Nations monitoring bodies and the European Convention on Human Rights. The government, the state, is answerable in respect of it to the European Court of Human Rights. But actually these instruments, we can't go into court, into our own domestic courts, and get orders stating that the government is, for one reason or another, not complying with, one aspect of one of these international covenants. And that surprises many people, but that is part of our system. The state's duties under international covenants and international law are only enforceable in our own courts to the extent that the Oireachtas brings in parts of those covenants by way of acts of the Oireachtas, by way of statutes. If that happens, then of course we can rely on the statute to bring a case in our own courts. And in fact, on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a very important, groundbreaking statute has recently come into force, the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, which many of you might be familiar with. And that act, its foundation stone is actually the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the reason there was a delay in Ireland ratifying that convention was because we were manifestly not compliant with it until we brought in this Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act. So in matters relating to capacity to make decisions, there is a big part of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that somebody could bring to our own courts, but they do it through the mechanism of the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act. Now, we've no legislation about DPOs and DPROs, So whilst the convention is very, very important, and whilst the state is under an obligation to properly implement what the convention says about DPOs and DPROs, as I've said, and I hope it comes as a surprise to people, but as I've said, we can't go into court and sue the state because they're not doing it at the moment, because there's no domestic legislation providing for DPOs and DPROs. But all is not lost, because the state is answerable in terms of its obligations under the convention to the UN committee, which Robbie mentioned, I think, in his first slide. There's a UN committee on the rights of persons with disabilities, which monitors how every state in the world complies with its obligations under the convention, or every state in the world that's ratified it. And they have periodic reviews, normally every 5 years. And the committee will look and assess the state's attitude to DPOs, DPROs, and any organization, by the way, can make a submission to the committee when the periodic review is being carried out. And it's very important that that's done, and that the deficiencies that Robbie has identified are brought to the attention of the UN committee. I should say that international covenants do inform how the European Court of Human Rights interprets the European Convention on Human Rights. So it is possible to try and introduce into the European Convention on Human Rights some of the thinking that is in the CRPD, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I don't know how that would be done in terms of DPOs, DPROs, but that's something that maybe is something that everybody should discuss at some point, not perhaps tonight. It would, but give some thought to it. Because, as I say, it can help in how the European Convention on Human Rights is implemented. But I mean, beyond that, and as I say, I don't want to sound a negative note, because the CRPD is a very, very important instrument, and it's a very exciting human rights instrument for anybody interested in human rights. But we just have to remember that that the forum at the moment to go on the attack is actually the UN committee, not our own courts. And that's really the point I wanted to make to people, and happy to answer any questions that might arise from this. But I won't say any more, and I'll await with great interest the discussion that we're going to have. So I hope that's okay, Derval.
Great, Michael. Thank you so much. And thank you for that clear information. And as you said, information that might be surprising, but really good to get the reality of the situation, and for that information to be shared with the listeners and participants this evening. So thank you to Philip and Michael for bringing us up to what will now be just a 5-minute comfort break. And when we return, we'll be digging a little bit deeper into the practicalities of disabled persons organisations, welcoming Adrian from AsIAm, who'll have the next presentation with us. So a sincere thanks, Philip and Michael. And there will be questions. I can see 1 or 2 coming through on the Q&A already. So we'll save those for the session at the end and get into hopefully a really interesting conversation with those questions coming through. Thank you. So we'll take 5 minutes. We'll be back. It's 19:43 now. We'll be back at 19:48 to be really precise. See you then. This evening, Adrian, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks so much, Derval, and delighted to be here this evening. My name is so my presentation is just going to give a background around some of the practicalities around DPOs, disabled persons organisations, or DPROs. So my name is Adrian Carroll. I work as Policy and Accessibility Officer with AsIAm, which is Ireland's national autism charity organisation. So we promote and advocate for the rights of Ireland's autism community. So we are autistic led. Most of our staff are autistic, neurodivergent, or disabled, and we were founded by our CEO Adam Harris in 2014. And we work to support, to coordinate, and to unify the autism community in Ireland, building partnerships for change, and supporting society to be fully accepting and accessible and inclusive to all autistic people. So our relationship to the Disability Participation and Consultation Network is that we are grant funded networks of the network. So we have been grant funded members since its inception, and we also kind of run a number of as a result of this, we do quite a lot of work in terms of engaging our community to support their advocacy and participation. So one example of this is that we ran a series of effective engagement as a tool for self-advocacy workshops with Mary Quirk and disability activist Vivian Rath. So that was which was very successful. We had a lot of great feedback and support from both the autistic community and the wider disabled community. So we are also members of the DPO network, which collectively is a grant-funded member of the DPCN. So the DPO network is a group of 5 DPOs who collectively advocate for disabled people on issues related to the UNCRPD. So we are collectively the network comprises of the Irish Deaf Society, the Independent Living Movement Ireland, Disabled Women Ireland, and ourselves, as well as the National Platform for Self-Advocates. So we are chaired by disability activist Jackie Brown. We contributed to we also contribute to a network position paper report alongside our colleagues, which will be launched in mid-December by Minister of State with special responsibility for disability Anne Rabbitte, alongside government and state agencies. So we went through a detailed engagement process with both network members and our respective communities and constituencies. So in the report, so we discussed the role of DPOs, meaning how government and state agencies can support the development of DPOs, and also support the meaningful participation of disabled people right across all strands of policy making and policy development. So covering some of the functions of DPOs. So I think one of the things, I suppose one aspect that has been already mentioned by Robbie and by all of our speakers today is that DPOs very much cover a lot, work in advocacy and representing our respective communities and constituencies. So we very much take nothing about us as sort of like a core mantra, and we work towards changing laws and policies with the intent of promoting equality, access, and participation, and the human rights of disabled people. In addition to this, a function of a DPO also is to really help to foster a sense of community and belonging among its members, but also in terms of representing a wider community. So we would also, whether it's through a membership, whether it's through having a membership structure, or whether it's through like a board or committee, for instance, or also as well but also even in terms of supporting fellow disabled people and disability activists to come together and to be a part of a wider community. There are wider functions to DPOs that go beyond just advocacy and participation, but the others function. But it also, because it brings disabled people together as a community. It also helps us to, so in very much in a strength in numbers sense, it also kind of helps us in terms of advocacy and helping to realize our power as both as organizations, but also as constituent groups within the disability movement. So other things we would also mention is that we offer dedicated supports for our members of our communities. So for instance, ourselves, we would offer supports through the community support team, through the adult support and through the adult support and wellbeing team, and they're all very much kind of intent, both from an advocacy and representation point of view, but also really bringing people together and finding us through a sense of community and shared purpose and values as well. So I won't kind of cover too much around the types of DPOs, because I think, as has been highlighted earlier, DPOs are very much focused on advancing the rights of disabled people and are governed and led and directed by disabled people themselves. For an organisation to be DPO, it must have a clear majority in all its decision-making levels. DPOs should promote and defend the rights of disabled people. It should have disabled people right across its organisation structure, as has been highlighted earlier, and must be independent. The UNCRPD is flexible in terms of how DPOs wish to organise themselves and operate in a way that best reflects their community and how they wish to represent themselves. So for instance, some DPOs might represent one or more communities of disabled people. So for instance, Voice of Vision Impairment is a good example of that. Or for instance, AsIAm. Other people, for instance, might seek to present a family, might seek to represent more than one group of disabled people. For instance, NeuroPride would try to represent people across a range of neurodivergences. Some DPOs also represent underrepresented groups or communities. Some are grassroots organizations which support disabled people in their local community. So examples of this might be, for instance, Clare Leader Forum to represent disabled people in County Clare, and Sligo DPO organisation, Disabled Persons Organisation, are kind of two examples of that from an Irish context. Some DPOs are kind of operate in sort of like a mainstream, in a space where they can advocate and support disabled people on a national level. So from a national perspective, these include the likes of the independent living movement, the Irish Deaf Society, and other organisations which are kind of span beyond that, but also seek to support people to be disabled people's disability-led organisations would be, for instance, Disability Rights UK. They do a lot of advocacy in terms of supporting disabled people, and they have quite a high profile. They're quite recognised as a national NGO as well. And some DPOs are international organisations. So, for instance, the likes of the European Network of Independent Living or the International Disability Alliance are two examples of this. So why does the UNCRPD prioritise DPOs? So as highlighted earlier, Articles 4.3 and 33.3 give DPOs a key role in putting the UNCRPD into law and practice. So this would involve overseeing the process and holding countries like Ireland to account for any breaches to their rights and obligations. So it prioritises DPO's perspectives over other organisations, for instance, Section 39 organisations who would provide services to disabled people. So one of the reasons why they would take such a view is that they would see the UN Committee, CRPD, both in terms of policy, and also the committee would see disabled people as experts in their own lives through their living experience, and the governments and state agencies must proactively consult and involve them with making laws and policies affecting their lives. So some of the ways that DPOs would monitor Ireland's progress is through engagement and advocacy, both by themselves of organisations and by their own members. They work with other organizations within the disabled people and wider civil society space, across both in terms of advocacy and to develop, and also in terms of holding the state to account through the shadow reporting process. So basically what a shadow report is it responds to a state report, which countries must submit to the UNCRPD committee, which Philip and Robbie highlighted earlier in their earlier presentations, addressing the progress in realizing the convention. States reports must highlight, so for an example like this would be DPOs might try to support, to sort of highlight the issues and the impact that state policies might have on disabled people's lives. And the other thing the other thing that might be quite helpful as well is there's quite a lot of materials such as explainers that out there that kind of cover what the UNCRPD is about, and also the sort of seek to highlight what the shadow reporting process is in more detail as well. So from the kind of covering what the DPO landscape is like in Ireland. So in recent years, Ireland has very much seen a growing number of DPOs, and more DPOs are seeking to reflect an increasing diversity of and intersectionality of the disability movement in Ireland. So so the development of more grassroots DPOs sort of are happening in tandem with narratives of disability starting to change, as more disabled voices are included and represented across our media and across wider society. So to kind of give an example of what these might look like in practice. So some organizations are intertwined with their respective movements. So for instance, the Irish Deaf Society, the independent living movement would very much kind of sprung from disability rights advocacy through the centre by the Centre of Independent Living, and the National Platform of Self Advocates very much reflects the self advocacy movement that has been by people with intellectual disabilities. So some organizations have achieved major policy and legal victories. So Voice of Vision Impairment and Robbie Sinnott would have in terms of kind of making changes to the law in terms of voting processes for people with vision impairments is kind of an example of this. Some newer organizations have come to reflect kind of increasingly this intersectionality of disabled people. So for instance, the Disability Power Ireland, Disabled Women Ireland, and Neuropride Ireland would all be kind of examples of DPOs with very diverse memberships, a variety of they seek to represent a wide cohort of disabled people and reflect their intersectionality through their advocacy and through their participation as well. Some are very strong advocates in their local communities, and some will kind of operate, and I suppose DPOs are kind of have that share a link with the wider community and voluntary sector and civil society in terms of their core ethos would also seek to foster a sense of belonging and acceptance and that active participation among its members, and it's very much kind of reflective of a wider sense of community within kind of Irish society, and also in terms of how advocacy kind of happens both on a local level but also on a national level as well.
So just
finally,
left, Adrian, thank you.
Yeah. So finally, just kind of going to quickly cover, going to use my last 2 minutes to cover some of the barriers faced by DPOs. So some include that there's no dedicated core annual funding for DPOs. So many organizations in this space receive no funding whatsoever and have to resort to being voluntary organizations. Other DPOs may have to rely on kind of annual grants or project-based funding for portions of their income, and don't necessarily have the and would not be able to kind of support their members in ways that they would like. DPOs also need additional resources to meet the growing demands for consultation by government departments and state bodies and to support their respective communities. So a lot of these kind of growing demands will be kind of in the relation of capacity building and in terms of strategic development. So that would involve how DPOs can kind of grow and meet their both grow, but also in terms of how they can be supported to reach more people. In terms of supporting and representing the community, they may rely on people volunteering their time, and they would whereas they would like to kind of make sure that is reflected in and so they do not have access to dedicated staff or to resources that may better support engagement or co-design or co-production that the state might expect. They may need additional time or resources to consult their members. They may need to provide accessible information and consultation processes to their members. For instance, if they need to produce materials in Irish Sign Language, in plain English or in easy to read. And finally, they may also need support in terms of navigating expectations around laws, regulations, and governance requirements. For instance, some DPOs may take a conventional approach that might kind of align with some of the laws that some of the laws and regulations that charities may have in the space. So they may have a secretariat, they may have a board, they may have policy or committees, and that kind of work, and they have to, and they might hold themselves to transparency and they try to kind of be transparent and accountable across their processes, but also in terms of how their organization chooses to operate. But others aren't necessarily supported by such an approach, and they may prefer a more collectivist approach, which may favor engagement and consultation rather than taking a hierarchical approach. And they may prefer mutual aid or support, or they may also kind of prefer having spokespeople as opposed or people designated to write their policies or to write their submissions or to act as representatives, but do not necessarily want to have a dedicated people that work in policy or dedicated people that work in communications or funds or grant raising. So they may not necessarily feel that the charities that having to operate by codes meant for charities may reflect their needs as such. So I think a lot of the barriers that kind of covered are very much tied to funding and also in terms of having the capacity to scale. But I think the other thing, as Robbie and has been highlighted across our presentation this evening, is that it is a promising landscape, but there are of course challenges ahead. But it is very much a space that there will be a growing number of DPOs that will come into their own, that will come into their own, but it'll also kind of that will also kind of reflect both the diversity of Irish society, but also in terms of the disability movement itself. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Adrian. I'd like you to stay on, Adrian, if that's okay, and I'll welcome Robbie back in because there's just a couple of questions for both of you specifically focused on DPOs and working within DPOs. And I think, Adrian, you've covered it off really beautifully there, the challenges faced by disabled persons organisations right now in Ireland. So Robbie, did you want to add anything else to that? Do you feel that there's something else you'd like to emphasise or anything that you'd like to cover in terms of those real challenges faced by DPOs currently?
Well, yeah, no, I know Leah was here this evening from Physical Impairment Ireland, and which is a sister DPRO of ours, which we get very close links. But and Leo, the problem is that people have to work all day, so they've hardly any time then left over in a voluntary organisation to commit, and all the consultation, a lot of the consultations are during the day, etc. But even apart from that, I think the problem we would find is that I mean, a lot of public bodies would, on the face of it, like the National Transport Authority did in parliamentary question recently, they said, oh sure, we're always engaging, we're sending them out loads of stuff. The problem is A, that's inaccessible. We always tell them that. It's always ignored. And B, our views and opinions are aggregated with the hundreds or thousands of others that are added in there. So what is the incentive for us to go to work very hard at putting together a collective voice and a collective policy, which and consulting with our members and making sure that the least voices are prioritised, etc. What is the incentive for us when we put in all that work and it's just aggregated rather than our collective voice being respected for what it is?
Yeah. Thanks, Robbie, for adding that. I think there's a really clear picture between both of you about those real challenges. And I suppose just to bring us into a space of, if people were listening and are on the call tonight and wondering about joining a DPO or figuring out their space within a DPO, how would you say, Adrian, what would be the benefits of joining a DPO as you see it for a disabled person who might be listening this evening?
I think in terms of joining a DPO, I think where I would see as the main benefits of DPOs is feeling that you're part of a tribe, that you're part of a community, that you're part of a community, and that you're also organising and advocating collectively on issues that people that you as a group or as you might experience as a disabled person collectively. There is this, so it kind of takes into that kind of perception. So it's very much kind of that sort of strength in numbers, but also as well, it's also kind of opportunity to really work with other DPOs, but also with other groups within the wider community, that represent other communities on issues that you might face that you might face in common. So we all know as well that we're not just I think there's many, so DPOs among its membership might include people who have multiple disabilities, people who might be disabled, who might be a disabled person who come from a marginalized background, or they might also kind of face other forms of they might also kind of face other forms of exclusion or discrimination. So it's really important. So I think it's really good opportunity as well to be able to kind of, and in much the same way that many groups within the community and voluntary sector more generally tend to collaborate and work together on different projects, there is also an opportunity for both DPOs to work within themselves, but also with other groups as well, and to really kind of both to raise the conscience, basically kind of raise, I suppose, the awareness of raise awareness of issues on the ground, but also also kind of really realize, but also as well, it also kind of taps into the wider disability rights movement, which has worked a great deal to deliver change on the ground, both in Irish society and across the world. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Sure. I think it's also just to mention as well that, like, I think that there's a lot of, it's a really kind of thriving opportunity to join a DPO. But I think the challenges for DPOs coming ahead is, as there's more opportunities for us to kind of influence policies that kind of affect our lives, is to really scale to meet those, and to better support the needs of our communities.
Great, thanks, Adrian. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Robbie, in terms of the benefits of joining a DPO?
Sure, yeah, actually, we'd be more, I suppose, elastoplast about it, in that if we don't fill in this a very fragile space, and it's up to us to make sure that this space is a thing in Ireland, because it hasn't been a thing as far as most public bodies are concerned since 2018. And VVI's put a lot of work into Dublin City Council having a framework that prioritises DPROs, but we can't go to all 31 local authorities and do exactly the same. And the Housing Agency has made incredible progress in the last 2 years as well. So there are some shining lights and examples, but there are between 150 and 600 public bodies, depending on how you calculate it. It needs to be top down. It needs to come from the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, DCEDI for short. But I suppose our main point is, if we do not occupy this space and make sure that it's strengthened and that it's nourished, it will disappear. And we owe it to not just ourselves, we owe it to people coming after us, because it'll be very difficult to get it back. That's what happened in Britain. So the service providers, their equivalent of the Section 38s and 39s, they made sure that they weren't moving, and so they dominate the sector. All consultations totally anti-CRPD. So it's the conflict of interest that doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. So look, so we've a long way to go in Ireland, but we need people. We're sort of in a halfway house in that if we have hundreds or thousands of members, we sort of would have to manage expectations as long as DPROs are being treated as much as they are. But I have to say, a lot of our reps do, despite the frustrations, and there are a lot of frustrations, they do find it invigorating work, and they do love being involved, because there's one thing worse, and there's nothing worse than just lying down and taking it. It's good to be able to stand up and actually do something about something, So
Right.
anyway.
Thanks, Robbie. And I'll stick with you for the next part of that question, because I suppose that's, you've given a really good overview of, the benefits of joining a DPO. And Adrian, you touched on it earlier about that sense of, collaboration also, and the need for organizations and people to work together across the whole community. And I suppose, Robbie, could you maybe answer a question around what are the benefits of then, if you're not in a DPO, you mightn't be a disabled person, you're working in another space, but you care about, disability rights, and you want to kind of be supportive. What are the benefits then in supporting DPOs if you're in that space?
Well, there's so many. First of all, okay, I suppose one way of looking at it is the human rights approach. I know that sounds abstract, but if you go to any other organization, or even a researcher like Red Sea or somebody, they will just do a majoritarian type of a research or something. You're not going to get it. It's very difficult to reach smaller sectors of the population. So let's say about 1% of the population being severely visually impaired. They're very hard to accurately get, but it doesn't even do the right. So even if you've a focus group of 8 people, maybe none of them read Braille, but yet Braille is a human right, and it's throughout the CRPD. So it's about getting those things right. And we've got the work already done. So there's no reinvention of the wheel. So anything missing in our policies and somebody's going through them, we love them to get in touch with us and say, we don't understand X or Y. So we go back to our members and we discuss it, and it's open. We invite all members to join any subgroup that we have, because we have a structure with reps, which are the representatives. But and so we work it from there, and we make sure that these things are filled in, because it's a learning process for us in that way as well. So, but we definitely have to prioritize those with least resources and least supports, which is the human rather than the majoritarian model. But it's just, we've got a lot of stuff done already. There's no reinvention of the wheel. They'll get consistency. Back to DPROs, they won't have to keep doing research that was done last week by another public body. They have the consistency. They have it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. We're the experts, as Phil was saying. So you can't go wrong.
Great, thank you. I might bring Philip and Michael back in now as well. If you could come back in. Just there's 1 or 2 questions in the chat that I think might be interesting to focus on as well. And Philip, earlier you were really clear on this, so I think maybe just for us to emphasize this again in terms of the makeup of a DPO. There's a question in from a participant asking about can persons with a disability be in a DPO? What percentage of a DPO should be made up of by persons with disabilities? So maybe for you to take that question and re-emphasize that, Philip.
Yeah, I don't think there's any hard and fast rule, except for it says a clear majority. So a clear majority not being just a little bit over 50, I would say, and I don't know how it's kind of almost like a common sense. How do people kind of think about this? I would say you'd be looking at something like what you'd call a qualified majority, which would be something like 60% maybe or more. And I think the point isn't how many or what percentage, it's to strike the right balance, to get the expertise from the people who can give it, and to have and ensure that the organization is led by those people and governed by those people in the right way. It might take 60%, it might take 70% or more. I mean, I think we don't really know at this stage. I mean, I think the likes of Robbie and Adrian are really forging a path into unknown territory here, and we're, as Robbie said there, learning as we go, and every day is a day we learn. And I think this is just another one of those things that over time we'll kind of realize it'll take this amount of people for this to happen in the right way.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Philip. Thanks for clarifying that.
Robbie,
did you want to come in?
It's just to say, like, I think it's reasonable, like looking at the US House of Representatives and Senate, and they have a clear majority being 67%. Now, I know it's very rigid and all the rest of it, but I think it's reasonable to be there or thereabouts, or to be 2/3. I think it would be very useful in the registration when a register has been set up for something to be agreed on. But I mean, we would aim for 100% in our organisation, apart from parents, especially, or parents in particular, or guardians of visually impaired children, and we definitely welcome on the mat for them as well. But definitely, we would be, our interpretation of it, which may not be right or wrong, it's just our interpretation, is 2/3 anyway.
Sure. Thanks, Robbie. And Michael, I might bring you in there as well. There was another question. Now, this is a big one, and we could spend the rest of the evening and the year probably answering this. But I suppose I was just struck by some of the information that you gave the participants earlier about, the state's obligations under UNCRPD, and the question that has come in says, when will Ireland fully implement UNCRPD, and why hasn't it, in your opinion? So, as I said, we could talk about this until the 22nd of December maybe, but it would be really great to get your insights into why a state maybe, hasn't ratified an optional protocol, or, what our obligations are, because you were really clear on that earlier. So I'll just bring you in at this stage.
Well, I mean, it's a great question, but as I say, we have this system whereby our international legal obligations only become enforceable in our domestic courts when we bring in legislation that gives force to the international agreement. And there's so much in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, excuse me, I mean, there's so much to it that, there would have to be an enormous amount of separate legislation, different acts bringing in different types of law. So, I mean, the question as to when will we ever implement it fully is that's a question that really only the politicians can answer, I think. And I mean, it is, I think we all know, don't we? I mean, the convention is regarded as really quite a radical instrument, and a lot of people wouldn't agree with parts of it. I was actually quite disappointed to read a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. It's about a year ago now, and I'm really sorry that it's eluding me. I think it was against Spain. And it was to do with an adult with an intellectual disability. And under Spanish law, she was deprived of a vote in general election, in elections. And this would be contrary to the CRPD. And eventually the case was brought to the European Court of Human Rights to say, look, Spanish law is not compliant with the convention. I think this is very disappointing, but the European Court of Human Rights decided that under the European Convention, there wasn't the kind of guarantee that there would be under the CRPD to protect this adult's rights as a person with an intellectual disability. So they held there was no breach of the convention. Now, I just say that as an example of differing views on the CRPD, and that aspect, the right to vote in the CRPD, is not now accepted by the European Court of Human Rights. It might be over time, because the European Court of Human Rights does change its position if it feels that all the states that are signed up to the European Convention, if it thinks that there's a general consensus that has moved But at this point in time, this judgment's about a year ago, and I'm really sorry I can't remember the name of it. I'm pretty sure it was against Spain. But so I mean, it might move over time. But sorry, this is a bit of a long-winded answer. I can't say. I mean, whether the whole of the CRPD will ever be implemented by Ireland, I think is questionable. Certainly, there are aspects of it that I think there isn't general agreement about whether they're good or not. So well, I don't know whether that's answered the question. I'm sorry if it hasn't. It's a very, very big question, and it's a very good question. I mean, the fact that I can't answer doesn't mean it's not a good question. It's a great question. Sorry,
it's
Phil.
a great conversation starter, and I think it's the kind of thing that we need to talk more and more about. So I thank the participant for sending it in to us, and thank you, Michael. Philip, did you want to come in and?
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Michael, like, what does he think? And I suppose I'm now the questioner. What does he think the role of the optional protocol is here? Because, you know, there is a role there. You can raise complaints. How does this fit in now with this disappointing, which is obviously a very, very disappointing outcome? Is there anything can be done through that, let's say, route that might assist?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, if this judgment, I'll tell you what I'll do. When the next question's up and somebody else answering, I'll try and find out the name of this judgment for you. Well, I will be able to find it out. If the judgment's against Spain, and we haven't really spoken much about this optional protocol, and for anybody who's not too sure what we're talking about, what that would mean is that an individual could bring a complaint against Ireland for non-compliance with the CRPD, and that complaint would go to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and they would hear it. And this happens against Ireland. I mean, for example, I represented a lady, her name is public, Elizabeth Coppin, who was in the Magdalen Laundries and in mother and baby homes, and we brought a case for her to the UN Committee Against Torture on the basis that Ireland was in breach of its obligations in not having ever carried out a proper independent investigation as to how all of that was allowed to happen. Now, we didn't succeed, unfortunately, although we did get to having a full assessment. So these kind of things can happen. The judgment, Phil, if it is against Spain, if Spain has signed up for the optional protocol, which Ireland hasn't yet, then you're right, that young person, well, I think it's a relatively young adult, that person or her mother on her behalf or whatever could bring an application to the committee. I'll have a look for that judgment now.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. And that would be great. Maybe we could share that with the presentations and the recording after the seminar this evening as well. That would be really useful, Michael, as a follow-up. I'm really conscious of time, and there were one or two other quick questions that came in earlier. So one is around proposals for supporting and funding DPOs for capacity building and advocacy. Adrian, I might bring you in on that. You know, if you have any thoughts on that in terms of funding proposals and how that could work in practice for DPOs to support capacity building.
I think to be honest, I think it's what I kind of found in my experience is that many disabled, I suppose, DPOs have found, I think it's have sought, I suppose, like to be supported by the Department of Children through the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth as a source of core annual funding. But I think but have kind of found but I think may not. I think the big, I suppose, like the issue, I guess, as well, that would be to look at like how we can kind of support people through providing core annual funding, through whether it's through the CED or whether it's through another agency, for instance, the Department of through a different kind of government department, or through PUBL as well. I think one of the things that's really important is making sure that funding is accessible to organizations and to communities as well, and making sure that I suppose like the funding requirements aren't too onerous or don't produce don't produce I suppose an administrative burden as well. In my experience as well, with some fundings from government departments, there can be a lot of regulations and a lot of law and a lot of policies that you would have to kind of follow, and you would have to follow them to, I suppose, the letter, to make sure that you maintain access to funding. So it's really, I suppose it's really important to make sure that that there is both while agencies like Pobble do fund DPOs and charities and governance and charities and other organizations, that they've only really maintained access to that funding because they comply with governance structures that may be and through whether it's through the Charities Act or other form, or through I suppose like the governance code as well. And I think it's really important to also kind of mention that those sources of funding aren't always accessible to DPOs, and I think for a dedicated funding structure as well, that needs to kind of align with the DPO sort of mission and kind of objectives. So whether it's through developing kind of advocacy or participation, but also even in terms of building membership and building kind of governance that best kind of suits their needs. So I think it has to be able to achieve a number of objectives, but it also has to be flexible to be able to meet DPO's needs. So whilst there isn't a concrete national, I suppose, example as such, there are opportunities for us to do so with the corporate with DPOs and disabled people involved right throughout the process. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Adrian. That's great. I'm conscious of time and needing to bring the session to a close, which is a pity because I think we could continue for another while. So and just to draw to a close on that note, just to thank all of our panelists this evening for their time and their expertise and their knowledge sharing. I've certainly learned a lot, and it's the type of conversation that we could keep going for a long time. So thank you to Adrian Carroll from AsIAm, to Robbie Sinnott from Voice of Vision Impairment, Philip Reynor and Michael Lynn, to our interpreters this evening. I'd like to give a warm thanks as well to Nicole Lonergan, the coordinator of the DPCN, for all her work in the background to make these seminars happen and work and get people to the table and share information together. So thank you, Nicole, for that. And I'd also like to mention, in the spirit of collaboration and the rest of the DPCN steering group, so you've got the Disability Federation of Ireland, Inclusion Ireland, Mental Health Reform, Voice of Vision Impairment, Physical Impairment Ireland, and the DPO network itself, which is Independent Living Movement Ireland, Disabled Women Ireland, the National Platform of Self-Advocates, AsIAm, and the Irish Deaf Society. So thank you to each and every one of those organisations. I suppose the DPCN over the last couple of months has been offering and sharing information sessions in that space of capacity building and knowledge and awareness raising. So I know this is the final session of 2023, but you can access the information on those previous sessions on the DPCN website. So thank you all for joining us this evening. It's certainly been a fantastic session of learning, and Nicole will be in touch with everybody who signed up to the session, sharing the presentations and any information coming forth from Michael and anybody else on the panel that wants to share additional information. We will circulate that to people at a later date. Good evening, everybody.
I'll just send in the chat box
Great.
the name of that case and the link to the judgment, if everybody can get it.
That's great, Michael. We'll copy that into the correspondence to everybody after the event. Take care. Good night.
Cheers, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.